Welcome back, everybody, to the Hope Axis. I'm Anna Gad. This is my new podcast where in each episode, I'm investigating what there is to hope for in the world with a distinguished person in technology, the arts, media. Today, it's Reggie James, my old Twitter friend and relatively new offline friend, who is a designer and the co-founder and CEO of Eternal, a mysterious Gen Z hyper-tech reality that I'm sure he will tell us more about. Today, we will talk about spiritual technology and the relationship between technical design. And by technical design, we mean something from the earliest day, like the invention of the fountain and the coach, and religion or spirituality. Reggie recently gave a talk and then published this talk on his own Substack, Hip City Reg, titled Spiritual Technology. It's in the description of this video, or if you're listening to us audio, look it up, Hip City Reg, Spiritual Technology. And you, in this piece, contrast spiritual technologies with what you call secu-tech, which is secular technology. You have a whole thesis developed based on Marshall McLuhan's ideas on how the technical design that surrounds us is, for better or worse, based on secular ideals, but through which people do try to, or at least they can't stop themselves from trying to reach for the stars, trying to achieve spiritual goals. And so, first of all, welcome, Reggie. This is such an honor to have you here. You're one of my favorite New York influencers. If you guys are considering moving to New York or trying to decide where to go, what furniture to buy, what parties to go to, Reggie is your person. Like, just do what he does, and you will end up in a beautiful and amazing environment in New York with great friends. Welcome, Reg. Tell us, how did you become a designer? What happened? Who hurt you?
Yeah. What happened? Who hurt me? I think college hurt me. That's for sure. I did undergrad at Wharton at University of Pennsylvania. And that was really, I was having this conversation with my parents recently, but it was really inspired by my parents. I wanted to study architecture at Stanford. And my parents said, no California, no architecture. And then I got sort of
California part I kind of get. What was wrong with architecture?
for sure. The
You
California
guys are like a proper East Coast family, so you have to be tribal about it and stick around. What was wrong with architecture?
Yeah, the California part I understood as well. It's just like it's more expensive if like there's an emergency. Philadelphia is only 2 hours from our home, and I'm the oldest, so it's the first kid going to school. So the California part didn't bother me as much, but the no architecture, I was just like, wow, okay. I think my godfather actually is an architect. And I think they saw how much sort of like tests and schooling and stuff you had to go through. And they're like, it takes so long to make money. Like, don't do that to yourself. And so that turned into me going to Wharton, which, as you can imagine, you kind of make money immediately after you graduate if you follow like the finance track. But that gets into who hurt me, which was Wharton, because academically, that just did not align with who I was, or at least who I was becoming. But actually, my now wife was like, I really think you should look into tech. I think like you would really enjoy the ways of thinking and blah, blah, blah. And so she really inspired me to look into tech. And then there's a series of New Yorker profiles that I lived on religiously while at school. And so the New Yorker had profiled at the time Mark Andreessen, Sam Altman, and Peter Thiel. And the profiles are really, really rich and in a very different tone than how the publication would write about technologists today. And I read these not like every night, but at least once a week, I would read one of them. And it really became a sort of archetype of something I started to admire. And then I just started I wanted to build. And so I don't know what happened, but for some reason, I think maybe because I wanted to be an architect, I just gravitated towards design and my personal interests were more design oriented. So I just started teaching myself design, and I would take a screenshot of an app and just paste it into Sketch at the time, and then just start teaching myself. I would just try to recreate it as best as I can. And then once I discovered Figma, I just sort of switched to Figma, and then I started getting more into writing myself. And now my design process is very writing heavy now before it is visual. So all my designing starts as some form of like writing or essay or set of prompts. And then I put that text into some design canvas. And then I start working off of that translation. Or I give it to Luca, my co-founder, and then he just translates it because he's much faster than I am. So yeah.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the Sam Altman New Yorker profile. I also entered tech because of the Sam Altman New Yorker profile. I remember the Peter Thiel one. I remember the Mark Andreessen one. And first of all, that says so much about us that you and I, we were getting our tech news from the New Yorker.
Yeah, what a time.
Humanities, we come from the arts. But there is a place in technology for us as well. And I think that's a little bit underrated or underestimated in how, engineering heavy, obviously, the tech discussion is. And that's just going to be so much less the case with LLMs helping you code, the no-code platforms. I think there's more and more space for philosophers, writers, artists in tech. Sure. I mean, one of the first people I first met when I went to California for the first time was Sam, because I reached out and I was like, look, you gave this interview not having any idea how many lives you would be touching. I think most of these people actually don't want to be profiled in the New Yorker. Like it's a liability. They are not really reaching their own audience. There's more to lose than to gain. But you never know. And it's so beautiful. And I wrote Andrew Solomon's book, Far from the Tree, as a gift to Sam to kind of like thank him. And he was just like, he didn't know what to say to that. Probably he hears from people whose life he changed. I mean, I'm sure it's the same for Paul Graham. But I'm really curious. I mean, I was semi-joking earlier that you're an influencer. Do you feel this responsibility that now that you have started Eternal, you're a little bit more established? I mean, you're still very young in the field, but in tech, you stop counting as young very fast, right? It's like the intellectual equivalent of ballet. So do you feel this burden already that you have to change lives and give interviews?
I don't know if I feel a burden. I think that if there's one real responsibility I feel, it is towards New York tech. I've never lived in San Francisco. I used to have a real angst about it, actually, because when I moved to New York right after school and I was taking meetings, I would be told like, oh, we'll know when you're serious when you leave New York. And so New York always became this sort of
people in New York told you this? Did you say like
no VCs in San Francisco would tell me this when I would visit, and sometimes VCs in New York would tell me this. And there was like a sort of brand or maybe just time period where even New York-based investors were not really investing in New York-based companies. They just wanted to be in New York, and capital allowed them to be. And all that to say is like, I think the one responsibility I feel, despite sometimes feeling very pulled to move to the Bay Area, is actually to New York tech. And that's why, my community project Terminal is really built around this idea of like seriousness in New York and demos and talks and installation. We had an event last night that was like, it was kind of like the first Art Ho version of the event. Curated a few paintings, and there was a live music performance. There was a projection art that was all, just rendered from code. And there was a bench that my friend Sean and his partner Amara made that also had like an RFID tag and web component to it. And it was sort of like this living memories bench from folks that interacted with it throughout the night. So yeah, it's a mix of really taking New York for what it is, which is very multidisciplinary, and combining that with the seriousness of outcomes and impact that San Francisco is known for, or the broader Bay Area. That's the one responsibility I feel. I think everything outside of that is more personal to my own like ambition. In terms of like the pressure cooker, I think the only pressure cooker I feel is New York.
I mean, as a fellow New Yorker now, I completely agree. But I mean, I'm an immigrant and I could have gone either way. And it's a real dilemma. Yeah. Like, am I going to go to SF and use that insane whirlwind that's happening there, which is
Mhm.
great? Or do I listen to the more subtle kind of siren song? And for me, I mean, I thought I would end up in San Francisco. I never had any plans to come to New York City. I always felt like, why would New York City need another one of me? You know, like this
Yeah.
is other people like me are. And then you
New York is kind of like famous for not needing any one person.
yeah. But it's also an aggregator, right?
Mhm.
And it needs more of what it already has because of
Yes.
the network effect. And that was just a very interesting thing to learn. I always feel like New York picked me. Like I came here
Beautiful.
and I was walking around. It was summer. It smelled disgusting, you know, full of rats and whatever. And I was like, I'm home. You know, like, everything suddenly makes sense. This is where I have to live.
Your New York
I tried to
reaction.
explain this to people. You don't have to understand, but like I felt at home in Budapest, where I'm from, and now I feel home here. And I never between the two, like for 11 years, I never felt home anywhere. And that's just like you have to listen to that because it's a very powerful intuition.
Yeah.
To circle back to the idea of spiritual technology, I mean, I've known you for quite a few years now, and then the world got to know you because you wrote a piece on being Black in tech. That was very contrarian, beautifully written. I think you moved the piece to your Substack, so people can actually read it. It starts with the famous James Baldwin quote that I'm going to terribly misquote, that I don't need charitable goodness because I'm one of the people who built the world or built the country, whichever works. Which, you know, as a immigrant woman, also you could force me into whatever little demographic category you wanted and send a charity to me, while, you know, we also feel like we're building the world. I'm just I ever since then, I always felt that you've been building through spirituality. Like what you're building is not just technical products or not just like a technological manifesto for acceleration, but it's a very strong expression of values. And this was even before you introduced me to the music of Frank Ocean. So thank you for that. Thank you for influencing my life to the better. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? First of all, this piece and how you entered public consciousness, and how do you feel that spirituality may have been there as a kind of influence for you in how you influence other people?
Yeah. The piece, as in like the Blackness piece. That one first. Yeah.
Am I correct to say that that was when, because I feel like you had a Twitter account and you had your writing, and a bunch of us knew you and you were in our circles, but that was when like a lot of strangers started paying attention, like who is this, or what's happening here? Did you did you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, I did feel the same way. I think that so I think a couple things happened. It's funny. I've written about being Black in tech a total of 3 times. But those essays do tend to really stand out to people. One was a critique on the Backstage Capital news, which really like blew up because I basically just pointed out like the math literally doesn't work. And why did no one point out that the math didn't work to someone that they're allegedly supporting? And that got me a lot of flack from Black people in technology, but then a lot of private messages from Black people in technology saying thank you. Right. And so
it's
I think
always like that. You have the public backlash and people are thanking you. And yeah. Do you want to talk about the math a little bit, or what was the kind of core idea there?
Yeah, I mean, it's straightforward. Like, I think the first fund was like a $20 million fund, and they had like 16 people on staff or something. So it's like anyone that knows venture math knows like a $20 million funds mean it gets to be a solo GP and like a part-time assistant scheduling your calendar. You don't get anyone else on staff. And people acted like this news was so crazy. And I was like, someone needs to step up against sort of what I felt was Black protectionism happening and really be an internal and counter voice so that, for lack of a better word, like, you know, it again, it just shows like sort of a lack of seriousness and then sort of scapegoating the issue, right? And they want to scapegoat the system as not supporting Black people. It's like, no, this is a bad manager making bad decisions that no one checked, and you're seeing the repercussions of that. And I think that there's this thing that happens when you take private truths that are not publicly expressed and then publicly express them. You unleash this like building up of potential energy, and then it becomes, momentum, like public momentum. And I think that essay did that. And then I think the other essay that really impacted people that you bring up is sort of, it was sort of the height of a lot of like the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter thing. And a lot of it turned into, in my opinion, and I might get flack for this, but a lot of it turned into sort of guilting people in positions of power. And I just never believed that style of identity politics really works towards any meaningful change. And I never think that like banding together and being like, you're a bad person because of these totally separate circumstances ever creates the change that you want. And so I just took some time to really personally express some of the reinforced narrative flaws that I was seeing in the industry, and hold that side by side to how I have chosen to express or not express some of my identity and for my reasons. And I think at the core of it kind of lies this thesis of like, if you put your work through an identity layer of like Blackness, for example, all you do is really invite critique back through that identity layer, as opposed to inviting critique on the object itself. And I think that if you want to, I think the impact that you're trying to have is the object itself. So why create this sort of identity filter on it? If it always felt a little perverse to me. And I think I've gotten like a lot of sort of pushback for that idea, but I do believe it's very true. And I think we saw it play out with women in tech as well. Like people that sort of put like a pink layer on like their work, then sort of like got attacked through that same thing, because you saw all these things like, oh, you girl boss too hard, right? Like that was a critique of like female founders, where it was like, you as a female founder shouldn't be this aggressive. Well, why? Because you made this whole thing about like how being a female founder is different. It's like, no, actually being a founder is quite universal. What it takes is quite universal. It's grit, it's hardness, all these traits or whatever. And it doesn't matter if you're Black, a woman, Asian, like you have to just do hard things, and you have to be aggressive about doing hard things if you want to like poke a hole in like the environment. But if you put these identity layers up, you sort of invite all this interesting critique, because people have presuppositions of how that identity is supposed to behave, right? Yeah, sorry.
I went to, there was this female co-working space in San Francisco that I'm not going to name. And I remember I had a meeting there, and I went there, and there was a pink hairdresser salon in the entrance. And I was like, that's
what are we doing?
Like, that's kind of more offensive. That
For sure.
That's like, that's not good. And it's just pink. And it's like, that's how you see me? I know. Like, I don't know what to say about this. Like, this is, and then, women get into these fights. Like, you have your type of feminism and I have my type of, it's like, can we just like be humans? But on the other hand, I also, and this is really just to be the devil's advocate or not even the advocate, but like somebody, the devil's therapist to understand. Okay. Like tech is extremely competitive, and everybody's looking for a unique selling point. Everybody's looking for an edge. Yeah. And I mean, it's the same when people are like super into their football clubs and patriotism and whatever, into their whatever local team. Like the easiest way to create identity for yourself and stand out is these really base qualities that we have, that, the stuff that is in your ID card. Like, okay, I don't like, that's not ever the proudest thing that I have in my life. Like, I want to be proud of the things that I accomplish. And Musa Al-Garbi was on the podcast a couple of months ago, and he wrote a book about this. We have never been woke, where he basically like argues that the elites from any demographic is basically, the elites are like using these mission statements as a way to legitimize themselves. And I do think that, having a chance at competition is a kind of legitimacy as well. Like, I'm an equal competitor here, but my unique selling point is that I represent only Black people or only women or only people who went to Yale. I don't know if they need representation. And it gets tribal in a very interesting and often very counterproductive way.
Yeah, well, I think Tammy, who like has a saying about kind of being young, and she's like, you can't be good for your age. You have to be good, period. And I think the same is true for any sort of, demographic title. Like, you can't be good for being a woman. You just have to be good. Like, what does that even mean? You know what I mean? Like, you can't be, oh yeah, like he's pretty good for being Black. It's just like, what? Like it's just like horseshoeing. Like, you're trying to be so woke that you become inadvertently racist. It's like, I just have no interest in
such cases. I mean, that's by the way, Tamara Winter, who is the commissioning editor at Stripe Press and our good friend. Good for something that's very. I mean, that's every time I think a woman is invited to a conference, to a panel, you kind of try to decide whether you have been invited for, 100%. Your actual ideas and accomplishments, or because you're good enough for whatever category other people put you into, right?
Right. Or it's this idea, and this was kind of what incited the sort of like Black in Tech essay, which is just like, you cannot choose. There's sort of like this myth, right, that like to be Black in tech meant that you had to speak on the Black things for technology, right? So if you're a Black person on a panel, it's because you needed to add this voice of Blackness to the subject, not about the subject itself. Just like, well, how do Black people think about this? It's like, what are you talking? You know what I mean? And that I felt such a
presidential candidate just lost because of this, right?
Listen, that's my next essay, and it's coming out very soon. It's just, the identity. I just think identity politics it's such a trap. It's such a trap, and we saw it in this last election. You had people that wanted to focus on a body politic versus real tangible issues that folks were feeling. And at the end of the day, white, Black, whatever, if bread is $7, bread is $7. The price is not changing based off of my identity. And well, we get the results that we get.
I mean, Tucker Carlson solved it by buying bread in Russia. So there's always that option, right? That's a different identity question. Do you feel that, I mean, in your piece, Spiritual Technology, you almost argue that technology has a kind of preaching undertone, that anything designed around us is conveying a message, just not necessarily through words.
Yes.
And, people, when they hear this, they think, they mean advertising or slogans, just do it, whatever. But that's not what you mean. What you mean is, if I understand correctly, is that every technical tool is trying to make you achieve a goal, right? You use 4 categories of McLuhan, and I will let you talk about that in a second. And what goal we are trying to help you achieve is a value statement. Like, I think that you want that goal, or I think that goal is worthwhile.
Yeah. So
very interesting idea. And I would love to explore that a little bit before we actually start talking about the capital G God. So just to ease our listeners and viewers into it slowly.
Yeah, gotta ease them in. So that idea around design as an embodiment of values comes from one of my favorite designers, Naoto Fukuzawa, who's a Japanese industrial designer, very influential on Johnny Ive and broader like Apple industrial design language, in which, this idea of embodiment, an example I always give is sort of pointing to like any chair that might be in a room, and this idea of like affordance, right? If a chair has arms to the side of it, and maybe it tilts back like the Eames chair I'm in, that has a certain type of affordance. It's very hard to throw my legs like over the side of this chair. It's very hard for like my wife to sit on my lap in this chair. Like this chair is about being locked in, right? That's what this chair is about. And that's what it affords.
Work done.
Yeah, get work done. Like get your wife out of here. Sit down, grind.
Everybody knows that whatever chair you buy, women end up somehow curled up on the floor in a very uncomfortable situation and clicking on your laptop like this.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we can look at sort of like, all product design this way. One that I like is, looking at Twitter or X and thinking about what like a quote tweet means, right? Like that is systematically set up for dunking. It's not about anything else. A quote tweet is about dunking.
We will cut this out. We don't want like to collapse, society to collapse because of this podcast.
Yeah. But when you are able to see sort of like, okay, what is the embedded value of this feature, of this piece of design, it starts to become really clear what the values of any system are. And this goes beyond technical products. This goes all the way to, the Constitution, right, which is a little bit more explicit in its values. But even the setup of sort of ratifying an amendment, like that's a design control system towards slow moving state consensus progress, right? And so we can look at a lot of things this way. This is also why the way venture firms are set up are interesting, right? Does every GP just get a decision? Is it a consensus driven, or are associates allowed to just make investment decisions under a certain check size? Like all these things set up it has a value system that it's acting on the world, and then we have to look at the outcomes, right? And so that's why the embodiment piece is so important, because then you can actually start to look at technology at a very high level on this sort of binary division, which I've never seen given before, which is what the talk is about, which is the spiritual technology versus secular technology. Because the large thesis is that all technology has been built in like a postmodernist value set. And that's the environment we live in. And we need to think about like, what are the other environments that are available to us that we just haven't really considered yet. So that's what I've been working on with Elon Rutberg and Dowda Leonard.
That's so interesting. And do you want to talk a little bit about postmodernism? Because you mentioned in your piece that it's one of the more, like, in terms of what it means, it's so heavily contested. But you find one description or summary that you like, and then you build the next step in your thinking on that. Do you just want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, pulling like directly from the piece, I pulled this quote from Hans Bergsons. And so I'll just like read it. So it says, if there is a common denominator to all these postmodernisms, it is that of a crisis in representation, a deeply felt loss of faith in our ability to represent the real in the widest sense, no matter whether they are aesthetic, epistemological, moral, or political in nature. The representations that we used to rely on can no longer be taken for granted. I just think that represents everything that we feel, particularly in an age of AI where you're just like, is this image a real, is this audio I'm listening to? Like, how was this made? Like, it makes you question every single sense of materiality / non-materiality that we come into, touch with. And it's just like, the only thing I know is real right now in this moment is like what I can touch, like if I can't touch it, question mark. And I think, so you can sort of pull all these values, right? And this is kind of where we start listing things of just like, okay, crisis of representation, like what does that map to? Okay, social media is just a constant question of representation, and that's why we have to post so much to like reaffirm whatever identity we're trying to present to like the broader network. Ideas of relativism, like the entire conflict of like disinformation and like what is truth, like that is a feature of postmodernist systems. It's not a bug, and so even taking something like relativism of information and showing people like this is a consequence of the values of our environment. It's not like some fluke of nature that we have to correct. It's like this was this has not only always been coming, but it's been here. Like there's always been competing newspapers selling competing stories on a thing. That's not new. It feels new because maybe like some guy in Idaho has the same sort of broadcast power as the New York Times now, but like overall, it's not new. And so, yeah, like really breaking this down in terms of what makes up our secular technology environment that we live in and day out, that was sort of, it's like telling a fish that they're on water. You got to wake them up. You're here right now.
And especially because we have this instinct as the little supercomputer in the monkey that we are, right? That, oh, if I can touch this, it's real. But what you're talking about, bringing up both the kind of postmodernist layer here, and also the McLuhan idea that everything that's designed is both enhancing things and making things obsolete. You will talk more about this. There's something brought back, there's something rejected. That even the things I touch are not facts. They seem very straightforward because our kind of visceral system might be used to actual things that don't have natural meaning, like a stream of water or a tree. We had to give these things meaning through first pantheism and then our spiritual evolution. But today, some people design most of the objects around us, and the meaning is already there, whether you consciously are aware of it or not. And that's a gigantic ontological difference between our ancestors and ourselves. So how can we use Marshall McLuhan, who was, I think, Visa Veresami's favorite quote tweet of all time, the great Canadian media theorist. How can we apply his thinking to this strange new era that we live in with meaningful objects?
Yeah. So I love Marshall McLuhan. He's kind of like my intellectual hero. He's also very Catholic. I became friends with his grandson, which has been a really fun relationship, because he would just like pull things from the family library and send me a
Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew.
Oh, he spoke at the Future of Publishing Festival that Interact organized. So Tammy was there on the stage. And Andrew was speaking downstairs. Yeah.
I love Andrew. So there's two frameworks that I used during this talk that I really, really love. One is sort of technology as amputation. So this to me is really, really key in like the secular technology, spiritual technology conversation. I think to go back to actually the beginning of the conversation with like the New Yorker profile, something that always stood out to me is that Mark, Peter, Sam, they all come from the middle of the country, very Protestant upbringings, they were not in cultural centers of America, I mean,
Sam is Jewish, but maybe that's a kind of American version of Protestantism.
Yeah, Sam is Jewish, but grew up in St. Louis. Like that's yeah. He wasn't like a Jewish in New York. Those are two very different being Jewish in America.
Right. Are you the majority or the minority? Those are always very, very important questions for religions.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had this musing before that I tweeted. I was just like, oh, this must have been in like 2019 or something, or 2020. I was like, oh, OpenAI is just Sam's quest to get a god that will respond to him.
Oh,
tweet it out, and
instant follow, no?
Yeah, instant follow.
Remember there was that guy, the later guy who wanted to build the Godhead, the AI Godhead. Do you remember this thing? Levandovitz was his name.
Oh yes.
Remember that guy? Yeah.
Many such cases of these guys, but what it really showed me, I was just like, oh, like they're trying to reach God like as a technology rather than reaching God through technology, and if you're trying to like get to God as the technology, what are you like really trying to get there, right? And so if we're looking at least the Christian definition of God, like and the qualities, the clearest one for AI would be omniscience, right? Like the knowing of everything. And if you apply McLuhan's sort of technology as amputation framework, it's like, okay, well, if AI equals omniscience, that equals like our own lobotomy, right? It's just like, if AI knows everything, we're really just chopping off like the thinking portion of our brain in a really sort of like critical way. And when I kind of came to that feeling, I was like, oh, well, this is much scarier than just like not having a job, right? Like, this is like turning myself into like a pile of limbs, you know. It's like I can always be busy, but if I can't, if the function of thinking is sort of disassociated from me, what does that leave me with? So technology as amputation was a really big one in this sort of critique. And then the second one was the tetrad, which we've been chatting about. And so the framework of the tetrad, to move really quickly through it, is this idea of enhancement, obsolescence, retrieval, and reversal. So enhance is just, what does this technology enhance? Obsolescence is, you know, what does it make obsolete? Retrieval, what does it bring back? And then reverse is like, when pushed to the limits, you know, what happens? And you know, I use the example of mobile sports gambling because I really hate mobile sports gambling.
I love it so much that you use that example. That's also, first of all, something that personally worries me.
Yeah.
But also, like, it's so under discussed in the media. Like, everybody's talking about like smartphone apps and whatever. No, gambling. What's happening to American men? What's happening to American personal finances and families and relationships and children by the sheer amount of people gambling? At Interact, you know how many, I don't know if your company has that, but we have so many engineers applying for jobs at Interact who are coming from gambling, and they are like, get us out of here.
Yeah.
So it's also harming the spiritual health of the people who have to work.
Yes. Of course. No, of course. I mean, I think that, you know, when you enter, let's just say like a gaming company, because this is something I'm just familiar with, and you realize you're optimizing for like addicted whales, just pushing the button, you would be disgusted to know like what whales might spend on a single mobile game. It's terrifying. And speaking of like the mobile sports gambling, there was something came out today, and I haven't been able to read it fully, but it was about what is happening in Brazil. And apparently people are taking out like a lot of personal loans to continue sports gambling in Brazil, which has really been not beyond just like messing with families. It's like a full economic crisis level in Brazil right now. Dark, really dark. And that's why I thought
it's also a really good extreme example to understand what all technology is doing in a way, right? Like we have to go to the dark end of it, where everybody's like, hair stands up on your arm, you know. That's where you understand what the most, you know, innocent looking things are also achieving.
For sure. Because, and this is perfect bridge like into the tetrad of breaking this down, right? Because okay, what does sports gamble amplify? It amplifies sports watching. So if you stop right there, you're like, oh, this just makes watching sports more fun. But then you immediately start to see sort of like the cracks in this, right? It's like, what is it obsolescence? In my example, I said the gambling house and the Diamond District sort of, you know, bookies a la Uncut Gems, right? If you've seen that movie. So it's like, oh, well, let's actually talk about the consequence of obsolescing that. One, like those are physical environments, right? So a lot of deterrence of, let's just say maybe antisocial or bad behavior is just that the physical environment for those things is not good. Like they're seedy, right? It's just like, it's the difference of sort of going to the strip club versus opening like Pornhub on your phone. It's like, well, I'm doing this in the private of my comfortable home. It can't be that bad versus like going to a strip club. Everyone sort of has a psychological thing of like, I wouldn't do that, right? There's a layer of Americans that just wouldn't do that. So that's already an interesting thing about
you lose all deniability if you go into, right? Like you can be unobserved, but you know you were there. I mean, in most cases.
In most cases. So we have like amplified sports watching, obsolesces the gambling house, the Diamond District bookie, and then retrieves personal stakes that don't involve you. This is such a classic sort of design element of all strong internet products, right? It takes something that has nothing to do with you and makes it feel like you have personal stakes in it. One of the darkest design patterns we have across the internet. And then finally, it reverses tribal loyalty. So now it's when watching the game, it's not about any team, right? It's simply about me and my bet. Another really powerful thing that the internet does. It takes you away from a societal health or, collective consciousness, understanding of your role in a thing, and solely makes it about you and your thing, right? So instead of rooting for the Lakers, I'm rooting for the guy on another team to get 20 points, at least 20 points, plus or minus 5. And I'm rooting for the Lakers to win still, but I also need LeBron to have 3 rebounds at least. It's like, that has nothing, like the game has completely warped towards my selfish desire for a certain outcome, That's not what a game is about. Like on like a James P. Carr's finite and infinite games, like you've completely shifted the nature of or the physics of that game, So yeah, you can use this sort of tetrad example across all technologies or design objects, and I think it does a lot to pull out its underlying nature.
And when you're talking about people wanting to somehow create a god in technology as opposed to reach God through technology, and you contrast these, what do you think happens to people's spirituality in a trap environment like gambling, right? Because there are 2 ways to get into online gambling, and this is two bad ways. This is not me selling this, right? Like, no, this is not advice. This is definitely not investment advice. So you're either driven by the fact that you have a financial hardship and you like somehow multiply your money very quickly. I can't, pull out research from my memory very quickly, but I would say that this is the minority of why people do that. The other is, otherwise neutral or good instincts that we have about teams and competition, seeking a challenge, fun, you're bored, you need something that only men do, like whatever you're creating your personal space, maybe you're in a life situation where the only place where you can be alone is on your phone, right? Which is still something that happens to people. And then they basically hijack these feelings. One of the most things I ever read about app design was that the one of the worst things that timelines do to you, and this is kind of at an extreme level when it comes to TikTok, is that they mess up your brain's understanding or estimating of exploration and exploitation. So you're constantly kept in a loop that you somehow feel is more novel than it is. So, because a normal person kind of knows that, I don't know, you live in a certain city, and if you want novelty, you have to go to another city for a little bit. And then when it's too much, you're homesick and you want to go home. Like this would be like one of the most, or the child leaving the mother, walking ahead, and then running back to the mom. Classic exploration, exploitation, like exploration being novelty seeking, exploitation being the harvesting of the familiar, right? The familiar. And so everything that's built, every technology that's built on novelty plays with this, right? Their metrics are around how much time you spend there.
Yes.
Like it's not like Uber, where it would be how many times you use it, how much money you're making on it. They have a very different incentive. And so I'm wondering when we talk about seeking spirituality, how would that appear in the case of, say, a gambling app? For their spiritual selves, or only at the start, and then somehow it erodes?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say that the gambling app is pretty direct erosion on your spiritual condition. I think even beyond a Christian framework, which is where I always come from, there, I don't believe there's a single spiritual ideal that represents this sort of tossing to high variance situations with capital as like your idealized self, right? I don't think anyone views spending time gambling as an idealized self. Now, that's not to say that like we don't enjoy maybe certain behavior. It's almost like junk food is like the most sort of like uh basic version of this, right? It's just like, oh, this isn't healthy, but if I don't indulge in it, it's fine, right? If I make a little bet with my dad, when we're playing golf or something, that's probably fine. It's silly. There's
I
none
can
none of
control it. I can stop anytime I want. And it's funny,
yeah,
both of these things are more like you can tell because people do it when they are drunk or high, right?
100%.
I've only in my life ever eaten at an In-N-Out burger when I was not sober. And I think
Oh no.
everyone. I know, right?
You gotta
Like
have a sober in and out.
there's a moment at like 1 a.m. when you're like, this seems like a great idea.
And In-N-Out burger is always a good idea.
Oh,
But but RFK Jr. is gonna come at me after that.
sorry.
Sorry, RFK. But I think like that there's an understanding of when something is a simple pleasure that is not habitual. But I think something like a mobile gambling app and their incentives, their entire incentive is to make it habitual. And in no world would that sort of align to a sense of personal growth, you know, higher characteristics you might take across to your family or to your community, right? It's not growing any part of you. It's feeding our reward lizard corner of the brain and trying to keep you just around enough or even like soften your loss so that you keep coming back. That is like textbook spiritual erosion. Because yeah, I mean, yeah, period. Actually, I don't even need to actually extend that.
What would be a technology like that serves our spiritual purposes? I mean, you and I, we're both building technologies, right? And we're very idealistic about it. You are liberating people's creative identities or multiplying them. I'm trying to give people access to the best ideas of the world in a much less filtered way where, you can be multidisciplinary, you can be multinational, you can be multi-generational, and you can be definitely viewpoint diverse. Like these are very idealistic projects that appeal to people's better angels, right? We are saying that humans are very complex and we have base instincts and we have higher selves. And we're trying to build technologies that appeal to the higher self and don't erode you spiritually. In fact, they inspire and enhance your life. Right. So what would be the simplest example for people to these are also complex projects. Like I remember reading your first investment deck a few years ago, and you had to explain to people what this is, right? Like interns, like also. Yeah. And then, we can also get back to your beautiful note of like how your thinking always starts with writing, because you have to explain.
Yeah.
What would be the simplest way, the simple product for people to understand what we're talking about, so that, individuals understand that you are also surrounded by spiritual technology. Maybe it's less addictive or less obvious for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one really obvious one that people probably saw the demo of, that I was genuinely very happily surprised by, was the meditation app that comes with the Apple Vision Pro. It's like this multicolored orb that sits in your environment and is just sort of guiding you through like breathing exercises, and it's very, very strong enclosure. I think you can set the time on it, and people are well aware of sort of like the benefits of meditation and breathing exercises, and creating a sort of enclosed environment for it through VR, I thought was really like a wonderful base app to have there. And I've done it multiple times, and I was just kind of like, wow, yeah, like Apple can just give people that, and it set a real tone for the device. or actually the tone itself was in conflict with the rest of the tone for the device, which is like sit down and watch, Apple TV zombie mode. But I think that's a really basic one that is quite universal across faiths. I think every faith has some version of like meditation attached to it, or at least contemplation. So yeah, that's a basic one.
I love that. And you also write about the rosary being an original technical product. How do you mean that?
Yeah. So
it's something that exists across different religions, right? Like in Islam, you have the beads, Buddhists have the beads. So it's not even the Catholics, the only ones who
create
their own fidget spinner.
That's right. So that was really an idea that I'll credit Elon with, Elon Rutberg, and he rightly points out, just like you, that there's actually multiple faiths that utilize like some like beaded chain structure for contemplation. And this really has to do with, again, like this idea of effect, right? All technology is about sort of producing some form of effect. And I'm not Catholic, but my grandmother was, and I saw her every morning, and honestly 3 times a day, she would do her rosary, and she would have, I guess, like Vatican TV or maybe like Spanish TV, the Catholic channel, whatever. She didn't speak English, so sometimes I was confused as to what she was watching. But it was this real understanding that there are sort of format and ritual tied to this object that creates an effect, and the effect is having a more graciously experienced day, right? There's a difference, or the belief is that there is a difference on how you will go about your day if you perform your rosary prayer versus if you don't, right? And I feel this generally, like there's a big difference in my day when I actually take the time in the morning to sit down and pray and meditate versus when I just get up and caffeinate and rip it, and this is what we mean. That's like an old spiritual technology. And so the question then becomes, what are the new spiritual technologies that we can sort of give to folks to produce very similar outcomes, right? If the outcome we're searching for is a more graciously experienced day, what can we design and give to folks that will bring them to that every morning as part of their day, the same way you turn over and pick up your phone, right? Like that is ritual. You might not want to classify it as that. Maybe you think you're just looking at the time, but that's an active choice.
And active spaces, right? Like the church, the temple, where you go and you're entering a different mindset. And this was Steve Jobs' big thing, right? Like, let's have Apple stores. Like, let's not sell Apple products.
100%.
Best Buy. They do these days, but do we have the temple?
100%. Yeah. And the idea also of sort of trying to make Apple stores community centers. Like that was a really big push for a really long time. And they still do classes in Apple stores and folks, partake. It never really materialized like Steve wanted it to. But like the original vision was like, this was going to be your community center.
Why do you think that didn't happen? Why do you think went wrong there?
My honest answer is that the products work against that. These products are meant for you to sit down and consume media. It's not to pull you into the store necessarily. You get excited when you're in an Apple store because you're playing around with like actually the same media that you always play around with, maybe just like a little brighter or something. And then you go home with that thing and you sit there. You're not staying there and drawing with like some local artist that uses their iPad too. That's not the point. So I think Apple's own products got in the way of their vision for Apple stores being community centers.
It's too individualistic.
Super. Everything about Apple is about the superhuman. Like from the iPod is this device that gets you moving and turns your world into color, and you're a cool silhouette. The phone is, you are now important. Like having a cell phone before was this real symbol of importance. It's very American Psycho energy. And now they gave that to everyone. And, it's this device that just, it's you, it's reflecting you all day. Even when I'm on, a Zoom or something, it's like, I'm looking at myself more than I'm looking at like the other person. it is narcissist, really embedded in the environment. So yeah, we need to get
Welcome to Interact, guys. If you want to look at other people, you're talking so beautifully about the gut-shaped hole in the soul, but you're also claiming that there is a gut-shaped hole in society. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, this is like when it got real hereticon, I think, like my dad's a pastor. I don't know if he would really dig the idea of like, hey, there's a God-shaped hole in the economy. I think he'd be like, whoa, calm down. But I do think like what happened.
We would love it. We will send him the podcast again.
I do think like what to the point of like the mobile gambling and that being like an erosion of like spirituality. Well, if there's an erosion of like this core part of the self, that means like there is a chance to rehabilitate that. And that, I don't think that chance necessarily has to be free, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with making a profit. Maybe that's my American pill, but these opportunities exist, and we've seen companies like SoulCycle or even Equinox like play with a lot of spiritual imagery and a sense of belonging around that spiritual imagery. And even the way that like instructors speak, it's always like these very self-affirmations, and they're in the front and the lights are like dimmed and there's a spotlight on them. And it's a lot like if you put it side by side to like a Renaissance painting, like the similarities wouldn't be lost on you, And I think that there are probably a lot of exercises we can do that would be significantly more spiritually enhancing and regenerative. And that's part of the entire probe of the talk, But yeah, we could take that a few different directions.
I'm quite curious. So there's a guy called Greg Epstein who is going to who's a humanist chaplain at MIT, and he just wrote a book called Tech Agnostic, and he will be doing 2 different events on Interact. 2 different hosts invited him, and like his whole theory basically is that technology itself is a religion. Like Silicon Valley itself is a religion. It's very interesting to me because like I always feel when I'm in Silicon Valley that it's more like a court system with its own kings and aristocrats and factions and in wars. It's far more meritocratic. I think it's really the one remaining fully meritocratic space in America. Like really is a place where you can be anybody if you're smart, if you have good ideas. And I've been living around the world for a long time. And before my life in tech, I had worked in multiple different environments, and you never see this. Like this is truly a unique thing. And the core to its success, it never occurred to me that it's a religion. I mean, from a Hegelian point of view, Telian point of view, yes, that there is a constant going somewhere, and there's a positivist attitude there in most cases. But do you think technology is a religion? Do you think that as a whole it performs a kind of a religious function for us, or is this is guided notion by people who may know more about religion than tech?
I don't think technology in or Silicon Valley broadly is a religion. I do think there are similarities. There is, I think, a general rational progressive belief that we can build and improve ourselves into some techno-utopia. But techno-utopia is more of a feeling of human systems than it is any one spiritual condition. And I think that religion has to address the spiritual condition. Nothing within Silicon Valley really, like as a macro structure, addresses the individual's spiritual condition. And that's why I would say it's not. It does organize a lot of human energy. towards this, again, techno-utopian outcome. And we have very clear understandings of what that looks like, right? It looks like being a multi-planetary species, is building the AI God. It's this AI God's going to unlock, perfect medicine and self-driving cars, and we won't have any death from cars, and perfect medicine, and you and Brian Johnson won't die from food causes and all these things. But none of that really addresses, or maybe, okay, maybe my hot take would be Silicon Valley is actually the perfect example of atheism as religion, right?
Oh,
it's like the belief that you're like fully separate and in control of like these perfect outcomes.
The kind of enlightenment fulfilling itself.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be like the best interpretation of that. Yeah, that's where I would stop.
Greg Epstein would love that. We will send you an invite to one of those combos. You and I, we talk a lot, I think, privately and also during this podcast and in our writing about people's spiritual needs.
Yeah.
And, we work on different things, but this is the big overlap between us. We both think that people are born with certain spiritual needs and don't go away. Like they are very, very stubborn things. The same way as our thirst for knowledge or our desires to belong to other people, we also have spiritual yearning. How, if technologists are listening to us, and based on my audience's general, proportions, that's very likely. So how could we encourage people, or what advice would you have for people who want to build in a way and the types of products that help their fellow men and women to achieve spiritual goals, as opposed to, trick themselves or stop themselves from achieving that?
That's right. Well, there's like the Reggie Christian answer, and then there's the Reggie like realizing like not everyone is Christian or believes in those values. So
both. It's just like, this is the disclaimer before the it's like, just listen to both and take whichever works better for you.
Exactly. So, I think I'll give the Christian answer and then I'll give the non-Christian answer. So, the Christian answer would be that we are aware of original sin. We are aware of our need for redemption. And we are aware that the only path to redemption is through our relationship with God, and God is love. So then you have to ask ourselves, well, what are the sins that we struggle with on a daily basis, on a maybe unique basis, right? Like, obviously, hopefully you're not like committing like the worst sin over and over again. That would be bad. And then what are the paths to sort of meditating on that towards an advancement in one's character, right? And shaping yourself to be more like Christ. If you subscribe to like design as an embodiment of values, that gives you a really rich ground to start sort of like listing what it is you're trying to reinforce or embody and designing towards those things. Okay, that's the Christian answer. So now for the non-Christian answer, maybe more broadly spiritual technology answer. If we understand that current secu-tech is built around these postmodernist values, right? What are the contrasting elements of spiritual values, right? So maybe a sense of mysticism, right? Mysticism stands directly in contrast to sort of like data-oriented outcomes, right? A sense of certainty, right? If social media is sort of this lottery of content, like what is this? There's a reason why like religious books don't change. It's certainty over like brought across time. That I think creates, again, it really has to just come through values. And then what I think Silicon Valley does really well is this idea of sort of longevity through maintenance, right? It's like this idea of there's a new software update. Like this idea of like maintenance and retention and ritual is actually really built into the fabric of Silicon Valley, because that long-term relationship is the value relationship. And I think that is the one thing that should be like brought over into spiritual technology. It's this understanding of like the relationship you form with this person on the other side is meant to be maintained and expanded. It's what values we choose to expand that over creates a whole new effect to these individuals. So yeah, I guess that's my answer. Yeah.
It's a good takeaway. I'm reminded of at the beginning I was pitching Interact. It had already been running, and we have had really good outcomes achieved on the platform. And I pitched it to an academic, sociologist, data guy, and he was like, "Oh, that's interesting. And could we quantify magic?" And I'm like, "No, honey, no. We will quantify everything else. And also, I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
No, we're going to measure everything else, but not the magic." My last question, and this is something I ask from everybody, and I think in your case, maybe you already have answered it. Is, say it's 2030, so we're 6 years. What will be something about right now that will be obvious in hindsight, but people don't yet understand?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think that for me, it kind of comes back to like this fish and water thing. Like my hope is that through like some of the research, Elon and Dauda and I are doing, is that people look back and they're just like, how did we let so many of these things just gain cultural prominence, because we sort of wrote it off as, oh, it's just another app of equal weight, I think folks are going to look back at certain things like pregnant women in the 60s smoking. They're going to be like, oh my God, it's going to be such a crazy image to compare, right? I think mobile sports gambling is like this. I think OnlyFans and Pornhub are like this. Like there's just these things that it's so clear that it is an absolute erosion of your spiritual condition, and that your spiritual condition is your physical condition. Like these things are not separate, There's a reason why like Brian Johnson's vocabulary is deeply like spiritual, like don't die is a very spiritual, like just graphic expression for someone who is like selling olive oils and things like that, right? Because the underlying sentiment is deeply religious.
Also very Abrahamic, right? Like eternal life. We're actually all 5, 6
Yeah. Yes.
The keys to the door to eternal life.
Yeah. And so, and I challenged him on that at Hereticon when we were a few drinks in, but
he doesn't drink.
He doesn't drink. I drink. That's why I felt confident challenging him. But I became a lot more sympathetic to sort of like his vibe. But point being is like, I think we're going to look back on these things like pregnant women smoking in the 60s, where we will just be absolutely in shock at our lack of proactive adjustment. The problem is, I think the libertarian in me, and I think the libertarian in a lot of tech people would say like, well, just have self-control, and to some extent, I agree with them. But I do think they're, I think there's just some things that are just such obvious negatives that, there's a reason why we legislate things away. It's not like these things don't have a serve a purpose. So yeah, I think that will be obvious by 2030. And I'm like, oh, we gave what to who? It's like giving iPads to babies. Like, I think that's going to look insane. That's actually, I'll switch my whole answer to that. Giving iPads to babies will look so insane in 2030.
We'll ask you and Evie in a few years when you guys have children, whether you've made it through a flight from New York to SF without an iPad with your toddlers. And then we will second part for this. What about this thing that you mentioned at the beginning, which is so beautiful, and I want to hear more about this, which is that you think in writing.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of think about word cells as shape rotators, and you're definitely a shape rotator. You're a designer. You think in architecture, even if your parents didn't allow you to do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Life is long, and that will be your the second
life is long.
Your life, the project for your golden years. Why writing, and how did that start?
Yeah, writing really started because I was really thinking about how could I express myself in a legible way from New York to people I was trying to reach. And I was still early in my design sort of journey. And, I think I'm an okay designer. I don't Luca's a better designer than me. So already at Eternal, there's someone better than me, which means that, there's like some 16-year-old in San Francisco right now who's better than me. But I genuinely felt that.
He's also in California, right? So you're a big
Luca?
patriot, but your co-founder is in LA, no?
No. He's in New York.
But didn't you used to do Eternal kind of as a bike thing? And then you converted him?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. He lived in LA for a year, but I was like, you need to get your butt back to New York. But he grew up in East Village and went to the new school. So like he's New York through and through. But yeah, so it really just struck me as a high velocity thing and something that I think uniquely touches folks also not in technology. And this came through during some of those essays that we were talking about before, when like the Washington Post hit me up and the New Yorker hit me up about another one. And I was just like, oh, like writing has this power because of also the media class, that it is translatable. And I think something that's actually unique about tech power up until very recently is that like tech clout actually is not very transferable. Like music clout, really transferable. Like music clout gets you into a lot of places. Media clout gets you into a lot of places. Finance clout gets you into a lot of places. Tech clout for a very long time didn't really get you into a lot of places. And it's not until more recently that's at least getting you into political places. But like in terms of
public intellectualism as well, right? Like some
for sure.
But also like in tech, people have an incentive not to be too public, right? Like there is this novel kind of well, not famous ethos.
Yes. And I think that's fading quickly. And I think it started with politics, obviously. I think, and like you said, the public intellectualism, like I think Peter really represents this, obviously. But I think like Alex Karp really represents the public intellectualism. I think Elon represents just a brute force-ism. Mark Zuckerberg, his entire brand pivot is more towards like celebrity. And so I think it's changing, but if you scroll the clock back a little bit, the only tech person at like Fashion Week was literally Jack Dorsey wearing Rick Owens. Like that was the only person bridging.
I love Jack Dorsey. Jack Dorsey, the first time I met Jack Dorsey, he was giving a talk at the British Library in London. And I thought that was so badass. And he was talking about how his whole interest in Twitter was coming from his obsession as a child with maps. And so from maps came the dispatch system, which is basically like maps turned into communication. And he like, the little nerd as a child, he learned like how the ambulance and like, police dispatch systems work. We don't know what he did with that. And then Twitter basically came from that. It's like you're checking in from different places in the map. Mm-hmm. And find out about these beautiful origins of some of the most, I would say, still spiritually enhancing products from the British Library, because this person has the ambition of positioning him or herself as an intellectual, and there's such power to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so writing really, it started opening really funny doors. And I also think, to my point about taking like private truths and turning them into public moments, I just think there's real power in that. I think there's a lot of power in that. And, I'm an avid reader. You can see, well, you can kind of see like my library over here. And yeah, writing just it forms really succinctly in my mind, and I let it out. And it's funny because I really struggled with writing as a kid until a fourth grade teacher really sort of encouraged me. It was like, hey, like what's something you like? And at the time I was like a avid, just like sports center. Like I would just memorize everything happening in sports. And he was like, okay, write me an essay about that. And that really unlocked my entire love for writing, because up until then I was purely a math kid, like math and science. And then that started me. And then at Penn, I really struggled at Wharton. It's very like test centric on like a hard curve, but I just loved like writing for like my very few like poli sci and like legal studies, ethics courses. And I was just like, do I like writing? Like it re-hit me in college. And then I just noticed, yeah, tech people generally don't write. Like they build websites, and they communicate through building websites or apps or things like that. And I was just like, yeah, this is natural and it's fun, and I love doing it. And then that I felt like that gave me really unique perspective on even how and what I wanted to design, because it just took me down funny rabbit holes. Yeah, like now, yeah. Like I feel like I can like make an Adam Curtis app now, right? Like I think a typical tech designer wouldn't think about making an Adam Curtis app, but because like I watched
that, like I want to be on the test flight for Adam Curtis.
Yeah, I want exactly.
I want a hyper-normalization VR.
Yes. Oh God.
I keep thinking about, like, I know his other movies are more well-known, but hyper-normalization, which by the way is 3 hours and it's on YouTube, everybody should watch it.
Yep.
It's the only movie that the last 3 seconds of this movie, and we're not going to spoil it, made me jump up from my bed and shout at my laptop.
Yeah.
It did not just predict Trump. It like explains geopolitics in a way that Adam Curtis does not really achieve in his other things.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. Please make an app. He would love that, by the way, but you probably have to open source the whole thing to like fit with his very lefty politics.
It's also crazy that like BBC publishes all these things, like the critique on power apparatuses, and then like BBC sort of publishing all these critiques of
we know.
It's us. It's us. We know it's us.
And that would be an interesting essay for you to write about, because he could not be able to do this without having access to the archive of the BBC. And so it's just a very interesting, weird double whammy there. Reggie, thank you so much for talking to me on the Hope Axis. You definitely gave me hope a little bit more. And yeah, everybody read Reg. He's amazing. And maybe one day we can use your app as well.
Much love.
I'm not going to ask about it. It's like a PhD or a book. You don't ask people how they are doing it. You never ask yourself, like, so how is your app?
Yeah, how's the app going?
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts.